She had $11 to her name, a dog with a limp in his left hind leg, and a wagon wheel that had given up somewhere outside of Prosper Gulch. By sundown, she'd have $2 less, and a piece of rusted iron the whole town would laugh about for a week. Mara Kestrel had lost her father's ranch to a banknote she didn't sign, lost her mother's locket to a man who swore he'd bring it back, and lost, somewhere in the last hard year, the habit of expecting anything good to happen to her. The townsfolk of Prosper Gulch had a name for her by then, spoken behind hands and half smiles. The fool who buys dead men's junk. She didn't mind it, not out loud, but there were nights her dog Copper would rest his head on her boot, and she'd let herself mind it plenty. Copper was a rangy red hound with one ear that never sat right, a dog who'd walked out of the ranch fire 2 years back and never left her side since. He didn't much care what the town called her, he only cared where she went, because he intended to go there too. That afternoon, at the estate auction of a dead blacksmith named Eli Vance, she spent her last $2 on a rusted mining forge nobody else would touch. A squat iron box, crusted with 50 years of neglect, its bellows rotted through, its hinges frozen with rust, the color of dried blood. The auctioneer nearly gave it to her for free just to be rid of it. She didn't know why she bought it, she only knew Copper wouldn't stop staring at it, tail low, a sound rising in his throat that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite a whine. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Mara Kestrel and her faithful dog Copper. If you've ever felt like the fool at the auction, like the one folks whispered about while you counted your last coins twice, tell us in the comments. And if you've ever found something worth keeping in a pile everyone else called worthless, we'd love to hear that too. To understand why Mara Kestrel stood in that dust-choked auction yard spending her last $2 on a rusted piece of iron, you have to understand what Prosper Gulch had taken from her, piece by piece, over 11 months. She had been raised on the Kestrel Ranch, a modest spread of grazing land at the foot of the Bitterroot Hills, by a father who talked to his cattle like old friends, and a mother who kept a garden nobody in that dry country believed could grow tomatoes, and yet it did, every summer, stubborn and red. Mara had grown up smelling of hay and wood smoke, learning to shoe a horse before she learned to read a hymnal, and she had never once imagined a life anywhere else. She married young, to a quiet man named Thomas Kestrel, who loved the land nearly as much as she did, and for a handful of years the ranch was enough. The two of them, the cattle, the dog they raised from a pup they'd pulled out of a burning line shack when he was barely 8 weeks old. They named him Copper, for the color of his coat catching firelight the night they found him. Then the drought came, and after the drought came the debts, and after the debts came the fire. It started in the hayloft on a windless night in early spring, and by the time Mara got the horses out, the barn was a churning wall of orange, and the house wasn't far behind. Thomas ran back in for the strongbox, for the deed, for the little money they had left, and the roof came down before he came out. Mara lost her husband and her home in the space of 20 minutes, and Copper, singed and limping, refused to leave the ashes for 3 days, as if some part of him still believed Thomas might walk out of the smoke. The town was kind to her, in the way towns are kind when they don't know what else to do. Casseroles left on borrowed doorsteps, murmured condolences, offers of work that dried up once the shock wore off. A banker named Silas Grady held the note on what remained of the land, and when Mara couldn't make the payment that autumn, he took the acreage with regret, though there was precious little regret in the way he had it surveyed and resold within the month, or in the smile he wore afterward at the mercantile, tipping his hat to her like a man greeting an old friend, rather than a woman he'd just made homeless. Grady was not, by Prosper Gulch's estimation, a villain. He was a respected man, a deacon at the church, a man who sat on the town council, and funded the new schoolhouse roof, with more generosity than sense demanded. Only Mara, and perhaps a handful of others who'd crossed him quietly, and lost quietly, understood the particular cruelty of a man who could ruin you and still be thanked for it. She took work where she found it: mending, laundry, a season stitching harnesses for the livery, and she and Copper lived in a single rented room above the feed store. The dog curled at the foot of her cot every night, as if standing guard against a fire that had already happened. She sold her mother's locket to cover a bad month, and something in her went quiet after that. A kind of grief too tired to keep grieving out loud. It was in this state, worn thin, half invisible to a town that had already decided what kind of woman she was, that Mara heard about the estate auction of Eli Vance, the old blacksmith who died without kin, out at the edge of town where his forge had stood cold for 3 years. Folks said Vance had been a strange one in his last years, muttering about a fortune he'd never spend, refusing to sell his tools even as the forge rusted around him, chasing off anyone who asked too many questions about his younger days working the mining camps up in the high country. When he died, the town assumed there was nothing left of value, just an old man's junk, fit for scrap. Mara went anyway, because the auction was free to attend, and because Copper needed the walk, and because some stubborn ember in her still wanted to see things other people had given up on. She stood at the back of the small crowd with her 2 remaining dollars folded in her palm, watching neighbors bid on plows and lanterns, and a decent set of harness leather, none of it meant for her. Then the auctioneer got to the last lot, the forge itself, hauled out on a flatbed, rust-caked and forgotten, its iron body squat and ugly in the afternoon light. "Who'll take this off my hands?" the auctioneer said, more joke than sale. $2 and it's yours, and I'll throw in my thanks for hauling it away." Nobody laughed harder than Silas Grady, standing near the front in his good coat, glancing back at Mara, with an expression that dared her to bid on it, that seemed to say, "This is exactly the kind of purchase a fool like you would make." That was when Copper began to pull. He hadn't pulled at his lead in months. Not since the fire, not since he'd learned the world could take things from you without warning, but he pulled now, ears back, nose working, a low sound building in his chest as he strained toward the flatbed and the rusted forge sitting on it like it was something alive. Mara had learned, in 2 years of grief, to trust very little, but she had learned to trust her dog absolutely. She raised her $2 before she'd fully decided to. The town laughed, the way towns laugh at things they've already decided are foolish. Grady laughed loudest of all. Mara paid it no mind. She was already watching Copper, who had gone dead silent, and was staring at the forge with an intensity she hadn't seen in him since the night of the fire, and somewhere underneath the laughter, underneath her own tired resignation, something in her chest lifted for the first time in 11 months. It felt almost like hope, though she wasn't yet ready to call it that. What none of them knew, not Mara, not Grady, not the laughing crowd, was that Eli Vance had spent the last 3 years of his life protecting a secret inside that rusted iron shell, a secret he'd carried alone, rather than trust to a town he no longer believed in. And it would take a red hound with a long memory for fire to bring it into the light. Getting the forge home was its own small ordeal, a borrowed handcart, a half-mile of rutted road, Copper trotting alongside it the whole way with his eyes fixed on the iron box like he was escorting something precious rather than something scrapped. By the time Mara had it settled in the narrow yard behind the feed store, her arms ached, and dusk was creeping in violet over the hills, but Copper hadn't stopped his low, urgent whining since the auction yard. She almost laughed at herself, kneeling there in the fading light beside $2 worth of rust. "It's just an old forge, Copper," she said, though her own voice didn't sound convinced. Copper disagreed. He pawed at the base of the firebox, whined high in his throat, and when Mara ran her hand along the seam where the ash pan met the body, she felt it. A give, where there shouldn't have been one. A hairline gap disguised for decades under a crust of soot and rust. Her pulse quickened despite herself. She fetched a chisel from her mending kit and worked at the seam by lantern light while Copper sat pressed against her side, trembling with something that wasn't fear. The panel came free with a groan of old iron, and inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with age, tucked into a compartment no bigger than a bread box, Mara found a leather journal, its pages foxed and brittle, and a small pouch that clinked with a weight she recognized instantly, having weighed out coin all her life. Not silver, gold, in raw unstamped nuggets, the kind a man brings down from a claim before he's had it assayed. Copper let out a sound that was almost a bark of triumph, before pressing his nose to the journal's cover, and it was that reaction, more than the gold, more than anything, that told Mara this discovery mattered in a way she didn't yet understand. This was, she'd realize only later, the first curiosity bridge in a story that was about to reveal how far one dead man's secret truly reached. The journal was written in a cramped, careful hand, and by lantern light, Mara read long past midnight, Copper never leaving her lap. Eli Vance had not always been the town's forgotten blacksmith. 30 years prior, he'd worked a modest claim in the high country alongside 3 partners, and struck a vein rich enough to set them all up for life. Until one partner, a man young and ambitious, and already well connected in town affairs, had forged papers to claim the whole vein for himself, driving the others out with threats dressed up as legal notices. Vance had kept his portion of the gold hidden ever since, waiting, the journal said, for a day when the truth could be told without getting a family killed over it, because the ambitious young partner had grown into someone with a great deal of power and a great deal to lose. Vance never named him outright in the early pages, only called him the Deacon, with something like bitter humor. Mara's hands went cold reading that word. Silas Grady was Prosper Gulch's most devoted deacon. She didn't sleep that night. Copper didn't either, keeping watch at the window as if he understood, in whatever way dogs understand such things, that the danger in this discovery wasn't behind them but ahead. Mara spent the following days reading deeper into the journal by careful, guarded hours, learning that Vance had left something else behind besides gold and grief. A second copy of the original, unforged claim papers, hidden with a lawyer 2 towns over, who'd since retired. Papers that could unravel 3 decades of Grady's respectability in an afternoon, if anyone thought to look. Vance had died before he found the courage to use them. He'd left, instead, a riddle in his journal's final page, a set of directions to where those papers could still be retrieved, written in a code only someone who'd known him well could easily solve. It was Copper, oddly, who gave her the final piece. Pacing the yard behind the feed store one evening, he stopped and dug at a loose flagstone near the old fence line, a place, Mara realized with a chill, mentioned obliquely in Vance's final page as the boundary stone where the old road bent. Buried beneath it was a second oilcloth bundle, a spare key, and a letter addressed, in Vance's same careful hand, to whoever might one day find the courage he hadn't. "If you're reading this," it said, "you've found more than gold. You've found the truth. Use it kindly, and use it for the town, not against it. I waited too long out of fear. Don't you make my mistake." Mara sat back on her heels in the dust, Copper's head heavy and warm against her knee, and understood for the first time in 11 months that she was no longer simply surviving. She was standing at the edge of something that could either destroy her, or restore, for the whole town, a fairness it had quietly lost 30 years ago. She also understood, with the particular clarity of someone who'd already lost everything once, that Silas Grady would not let this truth surface without a fight. Word travels strangely in a small town, and it wasn't long before Silas Grady heard that the widow Kestrel had bought Eli Vance's old forge, and had been seen in close, secretive conversation with the county clerk. He came to her door himself 2 evenings later, hat in hand, smile fixed in place like a man greeting an old friend, rather than the woman whose land he'd taken. "Mrs. Kestrel," he said, pleasant as church bells, "I hear congratulations are in order." Found something of value in that scrap heap, did you? Copper, who had never once growled at a human being in his life, planted himself in the doorway and did exactly that. A low, steady rumble that made Grady's smile falter for half a second before he recovered it. "Just an old forge, Mr. Grady," Mara said, matching his pleasantness with her own, though her hand rested, unseen, on the doorframe near where she kept a loaded shotgun leaned just out of sight. "Nothing worth your concern." He didn't believe her, and he didn't pretend to for long. Within the week, Mara found her rented room searched in her absence, drawers disturbed in ways meant to look accidental. She found a man loitering near the feed store, who startled and hurried off when Copper barked. She found, on the morning she meant to ride out to retrieve the claim papers from the retired lawyer 2 towns over, that her horse had been quietly, deliberately lamed in the night. A cut too clean, too precise, to be anything but a warning. It was Copper who found the real danger before Mara did. 2 nights before she planned to leave on foot instead, the old hound woke her at 3 in the morning, with frantic scratching at the door, refusing to settle until she followed him out into the yard, where the faint acrid smell of coal oil hung heavy on the night air near the base of the feed store's wooden stairs. Someone had meant to make her second fire look like an accident. Mara doused the rags before they were ever lit, hands shaking, and understood that Grady's patience, 30 years of careful, respectable patience, was finally running out. She did not go to the sheriff, who owed his position to Grady's backing, and would likely do nothing. She did something the whole town would later call either reckless or brilliant, depending on which side of Grady's favor they'd stood on. She went, instead, to the people Grady had quietly wronged over the years, and never fully finished ruining, the Alvarez family, whose grazing rights he'd chipped away at for a decade. Old Mrs. Fenwick, whose late husband's mining claim had been reassessed suspiciously in Grady's favor. A dozen others who'd swallowed their grievances rather than risk more loss. She showed them Vance's journal. She told them what waited 2 towns over in a retired lawyer's strongbox, and she asked, plainly, whether they'd help her ride there together, in numbers too large for one man's warnings to frighten off. They rode out before dawn, 7 of them, and Mara and Copper, and if the town noticed the small quiet procession leaving before sunrise, it noticed too, the way Silas Grady's face went the color of old ash, when he heard where they'd gone and why. The claim papers were exactly where Vance's letter promised, still legible after 30 years, still bearing Grady's own younger signature beneath the forgery that had disinherited 3 honest men. Mara brought them back to Prosper Gulch not as a woman seeking vengeance, but as one determined, as Vance himself had begged, in that final letter, to use the truth for the town, rather than against it. She presented the papers openly, at a public town meeting, alongside the surviving journal entries and the sworn statements of those who remembered, still, the 3 partners Grady had driven out 3 decades before. The unraveling that followed was neither loud nor violent, but it was thorough. The county land office reopened records long thought settled. The original claim, and the modest fortune it had continued to generate under Grady's name for 30 years, was ordered redistributed among the rightful heirs of Vance's forgotten partners, including a portion, Vance's letter had specified, meant for whoever finally brought the truth to light. Grady's deaconship, his council seat, his standing at the bank, all of it crumbled within a season, not because Mara demanded his ruin, but because the truth, once loosed, needed no help from her to do its work. What she asked for herself was modest by comparison. Enough to buy back a portion of the old Kestrel land, and Copper's own patch of grass to grow old on. What she gave away was larger. She used a share of the recovered gold to help rebuild the schoolhouse roof that had, ironically, once borne Grady's name on a plaque of false generosity, replacing it quietly with no plaque at all. She helped the Alvarez family reclaim the grazing rights that had been chipped away for years. She made sure old Mrs. Fenwick's claim was finally, properly reassessed in her favor after decades of injustice. The fool who bought dead men's junk became, within a single season, the woman half the town owed something to, and the other half no longer dared laugh at. Copper, through all of it, never left her side, never once in danger himself, but always first to sense it coming, first to guard what mattered, first to lead her, as he had that very first day in the auction yard, toward the truth other people had long since stopped looking for. There's a particular kind of justice that doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It simply settles, quietly, into the places it was always meant to be. Mara Kestrel never became a wealthy woman by Prosper Gulch's old standards, and she never sought to be, but she became, in the years that followed, a woman the town trusted with its harder truths, and a woman who never again had to wonder whether she was a fool for hoping. We think about her sometimes, about the $2, about the rusted iron nobody else wanted, about the dog who refused to let a good man's last, quiet act of courage stay buried forever. It makes us wonder about all the overlooked things in our own lives, the rusted, the forgotten, the dismissed. How much of what we walk past every day is only waiting for someone patient enough, or hopeful enough, to look twice? If you found a hidden piece of history, buried gold, a forgotten truth, a wrong 3 decades old, would you keep it quietly for yourself, or would you share it, the way Mara did, even knowing the cost? Until next time, stay close.